Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They had marched 200 miles in 4 days. Picture them now, these exhausted English warriors, stumbling south along the old Roman road, their legs aching, their shields heavy on their arms, the taste of victory still fresh from Stamford Bridge. Just 5 days earlier, they had destroyed a Viking army in Yorkshire. Harold Hardrada, the greatest warrior king of the age, lay dead in northern soil. It should have been the end. It should have been triumph. Instead, it was only the beginning of something far worse. Word had reached King Harold Godwinson, even as his men cleaned Norwegian blood from their weapons. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed on the southern coast. Thousands of knights, thousands of archers, horses and supplies and siege equipment, all pouring onto English beaches, while Harold fought in the north. Now the king faced an impossible choice: rest his shattered army and let William ravage the south, or march immediately and fight again before his men had drawn a full breath. He chose to march. Tonight, we will walk through the world that emerged from that terrible decision. We will witness the conquest that remade England, the new lords who raised their castles on English soil, the cathedrals that rose toward heaven, and the peasants who laboured beneath it all. We will trace the flowering of medieval civilization through centuries of faith and violence, plague and prayer, until we arrive at the twilight of an age that still haunts our imagination. This is the story of medieval England, from the Norman arrow that changed everything to the Tudor dawn that brought the curtain down on a world of knights and kings. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from in your local time. Feel the veil between past and present, growing thin as we cross into the autumn of 1066 to a ridge called Senlac Hill, where the last Anglo-Saxon king of England waits with his exhausted army, watching Norman banners ripple in the October wind, knowing that everything his people have built across 5 centuries now rests upon the courage of men who can barely stand. The oath, the comet, and the crown. The crisis had been brewing for years before the armies met. Edward the Confessor, the pious and childless king, who had ruled England for more than 2 decades, died in January of 1066. He left behind no heir of his body, only a tangle of competing claims and a kingdom holding its breath. On his deathbed, according to English sources, Edward gestured toward Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, and commended the realm into his hands. Harold moved quickly. Within a day of Edward's death, he had himself crowned in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, the stones still fresh, the mortar barely dry. It was bold. It was perhaps necessary, but it enraged powerful men across the sea. William of Normandy insisted that Edward had promised him the throne years before, when the Duke had sheltered the exiled prince. More damning still, William claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support the Norman succession, an oath extracted during a mysterious visit to Normandy 2 years earlier. Whether Harold had been shipwrecked and held hostage, or had travelled willingly on some diplomatic errand, the sources disagree. What mattered was the oath. William declared Harold a perjurer, a usurper, and an oathbreaker. He secured papal blessing for an invasion. He gathered his forces. Then the heavens themselves seemed to take sides. In April of 1066, a blazing star appeared in the night sky, trailing fire across the darkness for weeks on end. We know it now as Halley's Comet, returning on its ancient cycle. To the people of that age, it was an omen of catastrophe, a sign that God himself was pronouncing judgment. The Bayeux Tapestry, that remarkable embroidered chronicle of the conquest, shows Englishmen pointing upward at the celestial apparition, while Harold sits uneasy on his throne. All through the summer, Harold waited. He stationed his fleet along the southern coast. He gathered the feared, the military levy of free Englishmen, and kept them under arms through the harvest season. But William did not come. The winds would not favour a channel crossing. Weeks passed. Provisions dwindled. Finally, in early September, Harold was forced to disband the feared and let his fleet limp back to London. The warriors returned to their farms for the harvest they had nearly missed. Within days, 2 invasions struck at once. Harold Hardrada sailed up the Humber with 300 ships. William's winds finally turned fair. Harold rode north to destroy the Vikings at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. On September 28th, William landed at Pevensey. By October 14th, the two armies faced each other on a ridge in Sussex. The fate of England would be decided before sunset. The terrible day at Senlac Hill. Harold chose his ground well. The ridge at Senlac offered a strong defensive position, with steep slopes protecting the flanks and marshy ground at the base. The English formed their shield wall along the crest, a dense formation of overlapping shields that had proven its worth against Viking axes for generations. In the centre stood Harold's elite housecarls, professional warriors wielding the terrible two-handed Danish axe that could split a horse and rider with a single blow. Around them gathered the feared of the southern shires, farmers and craftsmen who had answered their king's summons, gripping spears and whatever weapons they could muster. They numbered perhaps 7,000 or 8,000. The Normans brought roughly the same, but their composition was different. William had cavalry, armoured knights on war horses trained for battle, a weapon the English did not possess. He had archers in great numbers. He had infantry from Normandy, Brittany, and across northern France, adventurers drawn by the promise of English land. The Norman host was rested. Many had been preparing for months. The English had just completed one of the most grueling forced marches in military history. The battle began in the morning. Norman archers advanced and loosed their arrows uphill, but the angle was poor and the shield wall held. Norman infantry charged the ridge and broke against that wall of wood and iron. Men fell screaming on both sides, but the English line did not waver. William sent his cavalry thundering up the slope, and still the shield wall stood. Horses cannot easily charge uphill into a dense formation of determined men with spears. Then something happened that nearly ended the battle early. The Breton contingent on the Norman left broke and fled. A rumour spread that William himself had fallen. For a terrible moment, the entire Norman army began to waver. English warriors surged down the hill in pursuit, abandoning the protection of the shield wall to chase fleeing enemies. It was a fatal mistake. William threw off his helmet to show his face, rallying his men. The Norman cavalry wheeled and cut down the exposed English pursuers on the open ground. Hundreds died in minutes. Whether the Breton flight was real panic or a feigned retreat, the Normans now knew how to crack the English formation. Again and again through the long afternoon, the Normans repeated the tactic. They would charge, appear to break, and flee down the hill. Each time, some portion of the English line would surge forward in pursuit. Each time, the cavalry would turn and slaughter them. Hour by hour, the shield wall grew thinner. The housecarls fought like men possessed, their great axes rising and falling, but there were fewer of them with each Norman retreat. As evening approached, William ordered his archers to shoot high, raining arrows down over the shields rather than into them. The exhausted English, who had been fighting since morning, could not hold their shields overhead indefinitely. Men began to fall with shafts in their faces and throats. The chronicles differ on exactly how Harold died. The most famous account, supported by the Bayeux Tapestry, claims an arrow struck him in the eye. Other sources say Norman knights fought their way through to the king and hacked him down. Perhaps both are true, the arrow wounding him, the swords finishing the work. What is certain is that by nightfall, Harold Godwinson lay dead on Senlac Hill, his brothers fallen beside him, the flower of English nobility broken and scattered. William waited on the battlefield through the night, fearing a counter-attack that never came. When dawn broke on October 15th, 1066, a new age had begun. The last successful invasion of England was complete. The harrying of the north. William's crown sat uneasy on his head for years after Hastings. He had won a battle, but England was not yet conquered. Pockets of resistance flared across the kingdom. The northern earls refused to submit. English rebels found common cause with Danish raiders, Welsh princes, and Scottish kings. William spent the first years of his reign marching from crisis to crisis, building castles, crushing revolts, and trying to impose order on a hostile land. The crisis came to a head in 1069. A great northern uprising, supported by a Danish fleet, recaptured York, and massacred the Norman garrison. For a moment, it seemed the conquest might be undone. William had faced rebellions before, but nothing on this scale. His response would define his rule and scar the north of England for generations. What followed became known as the Harrying of the North. Through the winter of 1069 and into 1070, William's army systematically devastated everything between the Humber and the Tees. This was not ordinary warfare. This was calculated destruction designed to make the region incapable of supporting life. Norman soldiers slaughtered livestock, burned granaries, destroyed farming implements, and put villages to the torch. They poisoned wells and salted fields. They killed anyone who resisted and left the survivors to starve. The Domesday Book, compiled 16 years later, would record vast stretches of Yorkshire as waste, still uninhabited and worthless. Contemporary chroniclers, even those sympathetic to William, expressed horror at what they witnessed. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman monk writing a generation later, claimed that more than 100,000 people perished in the famine that followed the harrying. The number is surely exaggerated, but the scale of the catastrophe was real. Refugees fled south in such numbers that they overwhelmed the resources of monasteries along the way. Some sold themselves into slavery rather than starve. Others simply died where they fell. William achieved his aim. The North would not rise again during his lifetime, but the price was the transformation of a prosperous region into a wasteland. A century later, the scars were still visible. The harrying of the North demonstrated what the conquest truly meant. Not merely a change of rulers, but a violent rupture with everything that had come before. The English learned that their new masters would stop at nothing to maintain control. The message was written in fire and famine across the winter landscape, and it would not be forgotten. Castles rising from English earth. You are a farmer in the south of England, somewhere in the years after the conquest. Your father held this land, and his father before him, working the same fields your family has worked for generations beyond memory. The old lord, the English Deggan who collected rents and rendered justice, is gone now. Dead at Hastings, perhaps, or fled across the sea to serve the Byzantine emperor in distant Constantinople. In his place has come a Norman knight who speaks a language you cannot understand, who worships the same God but in different words, who looks at you and your family as something between servants and livestock. And now this new lord is building something you have never seen before. You stand at the edge of your field, your hoe forgotten in your hands, watching hundreds of labourers swarm over what was once the village common. English labourers, you realise, men from your own village and the villages nearby, pressed into service by the new order. They dig an enormous ditch in a great circle, piling the earth higher and higher into a steep mound at the centre. The mound rises week by week, month by month, until it towers over the surrounding land like nothing you have ever witnessed. Atop this mound, they build a wooden tower. You can hear the axes biting into timber from across the fields. The smell of sawdust and fresh-cut oak drifts on the wind. Around the base of the mound, they construct a wooden palisade, enclosing a courtyard where the lord's horses stamp and whinny, where his soldiers practice their strange mounted warfare, where his servants bustle about tasks you do not understand. This is a castle. The word itself is new to your language, borrowed from the French. Your people built great halls, feasting places where lords gathered their warriors. Your people built churches and monasteries, but you never built anything like this. The castle is not a home. It is not a temple. It is a statement of pure military dominance, a fortification from which a handful of armoured knights can control an entire countryside. You watch the Norman soldiers riding out from the castle gate, their mail glinting in the pale English sunlight, their lances couched, their great war horses snorting clouds of breath in the morning air. You understand, without anyone needing to explain, that you could never fight these men. Not with your hoe, not with the old spears hidden in the thatch of your cottage. You understand that this castle is not built to protect you. It is built to control you. Similar castles are rising all across England, hundreds of them, thousands eventually. They crown hilltops and guard river crossings. They glower over market towns and brood beside ancient roads. Each one holds a Norman garrison, Each one extends the reach of the conqueror's power. The landscape itself is being transformed, reshaped to serve new masters who intend to stay forever. You return to your hoeing. What else can you do? The harvest will not wait. Your children must eat. The rent must be paid, now to a lord whose name you can barely pronounce. Above you, the wooden tower watches everything. In a generation, it will be rebuilt in stone. The Great Survey, Domesday. 20 years after Hastings, William gathered his great council at Gloucester to celebrate Christmas and contemplate the state of his realm. He was growing old now, his body thickening, his temper as fierce as ever, but his energies flagging. He had been fighting all his life, first to secure his duchy against rebellious vassals and jealous neighbours, then to conquer England, then to hold what he had won. Now he wanted to know exactly what he possessed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the decision with a mixture of awe and resentment. William sent his men over all England into every shire and had them find out how many hundred hides there were in the shire, or what land and cattle the king himself had in the country, or what dues he ought to have in 12 months from the shire. The chronicler marvels that the survey was so thorough that there was no single hide nor yard of land, nor indeed one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig, which was left out. The result was the Domesday Book, the most remarkable administrative document of the medieval world. Royal commissioners travelled to every corner of England, summoning juries of local men to testify under oath about the resources of each estate. Who held the land in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many ploughs? How many villagers? How many slaves? How many freemen? What is it worth? The answers were compiled, organised, and copied into 2 great volumes that survive to this day, their parchment pages still legible after more than 9 centuries. The name Domesday came from the English themselves, who compared the survey to the Last Judgment, the final accounting from which there could be no appeal. And indeed, the book was used for centuries to settle disputes over land and taxation. If Domesday said you owed a certain rent, you owed it regardless of what you claimed. For historians, the Domesday Book provides an incomparable window into the society the Normans conquered and transformed. We can see the devastation of the north, recorded tersely as waste across hundreds of entries. We can trace the displacement of English landholders, replaced almost entirely by Norman lords, within a single generation. We can count the population, estimate the agricultural output, and map the distribution of wealth across an entire kingdom. But the book also reveals something else: the sheer administrative sophistication of Norman rule. No other kingdom in Europe could have produced such a document. The conquest was not merely a military victory, it was the imposition of a more organised, more centralised, more demanding form of government than England had ever known. The Domesday Book was both a tool of that government and its enduring monument, proof that William had made himself master of every field, every village, every pig in his new realm. The old king died the following year, thrown against his saddle pommel when his horse stumbled in the burning streets of a French town he had just sacked. But his book outlived him. His castles outlived him. His dynasty and his language and his law outlived him. The conquest was complete, written in stone and parchment, and the English would spend centuries learning to live within the world the Normans made. The castle becomes the cathedral. The conquest generation passed. William's sons quarrelled over his inheritance, and one of them took an arrow in the eye while hunting in the New Forest, a poetic echo of Hastings that chroniclers noted with grim satisfaction. The throne passed from brother to brother, then to nephews, and eventually to a new dynasty altogether, when Henry of Anjou became Henry II in 1154. Through all these transitions, the Norman aristocracy sank its roots ever deeper into English soil. The wooden castles of the conquest era began to transform. Where timber towers had once perched atop earthen mounds, great stone keeps now rose toward the sky. The Tower of London, begun by William himself, grew into a vast fortress complex. Windsor, Rochester, Dover, and dozens of others shed their wooden palisades for curtain walls of dressed stone. These were no longer temporary camps for an occupying army. They were permanent statements of power, built to last for centuries, built by men who intended their descendants to rule this land forever. But something else was rising alongside the castles, something that would define medieval England even more profoundly. The great age of cathedral building had begun. The Normans had found English churches too small, too dark, too Saxon. Within decades of the conquest, they began tearing down the old minsters and raising new structures in the Romanesque style they knew from the continent. Massive round arches, thick walls, forest of columns, and towers that dwarfed anything the English had built before. Canterbury, Winchester, Durham, Ely, Norwich. The great cathedral cities of England all trace their architectural origins to this Norman rebuilding. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, still stands as perhaps the finest example of Norman architecture in Europe. Its ribbed vaults, an innovation that would point the way toward Gothic architecture, span the nave in great stone arches that seem to float despite their enormous weight. The cathedral perches on a rocky peninsula above the River Wear, its towers visible for miles across the northern landscape. Inside, the massive columns carved with geometric patterns create a sense of overwhelming solidity, of permanence, of a faith literally set in stone. These buildings were not merely places of worship, they were statements of cultural transformation. The Norman bishops who commissioned them, the Norman abbots who oversaw their construction, were declaring that a new civilization had arrived in England. The old wooden churches of the Anglo-Saxons, however beloved, belonged to a superseded age. The future would be built in stone, according to continental models, by masters who had learned their craft in Normandy and Burgundy and the Ile-de-France. The conquest that had begun with swords would be completed with trowels, stone upon stone, the builders. Consider the master mason who arrives at a cathedral site in the reign of Henry I. He is perhaps 30 years old, trained since childhood in the mysteries of his craft. He learned geometry from his own master, who learned it from his, a chain of knowledge, stretching back through generations to builders whose names are long forgotten. He can calculate the thrust of an arch by instinct. He can look at a quarry face and see the blocks hidden within the living rock. He carries his tools in a leather satchel, and he carries something more precious in his memory, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of construction. He knows he will likely die before this cathedral is finished. The great churches of medieval England took decades to build, sometimes centuries. The master mason who laid the foundations rarely lived to see the towers completed. He worked knowing that his grandchildren might worship in the nave he designed, that his great-grandchildren might finally see the spire rise against the sky. This was a different relationship with time than we can easily imagine, a patience born of faith and necessity. Each day, he rises before dawn and walks the site, checking the previous day's work. He examines the mortar between the stones, testing its consistency. He reviews the progress of the walls, sighting along their length to ensure they rise true. He consults with the bishop's representatives about the budget, always insufficient, always requiring creative solutions. He argues with the quarrymen about the quality of the stone they have delivered. He trains his apprentices, guiding their hands as they learn to dress a block or set a voussoir. In his lodge, a wooden structure beside the rising walls, he keeps his drawings. These are not architectural plans as we would recognize them, but working sketches, templates, geometric diagrams that encode the proportions of the building. Much of the design lives only in his head, transmitted verbally to his workers, adjusted on the fly as problems arise. When he dies, his successor will inherit the project, but not necessarily the vision. Cathedrals often show the marks of multiple masters, their styles shifting as generations pass. He works for the glory of God. He also works for wages, for reputation, for the satisfaction of seeing stone rise upon stone in patterns he has imagined. When the scaffolding finally comes down from a completed section, when light pours through newly installed windows onto fresh-cut stone, he feels something that approaches the divine. He is building a house for eternity. The bishops and kings who pay for this work will be forgotten. The master masons who build it will be forgotten too. But the stone will remember, the manor and its people. Beneath the cathedrals and castles, Beneath the politics of kings and the quarrels of bishops, the vast majority of English people lived lives bounded by the manor. The manor was the fundamental unit of medieval rural society, an estate comprising a lord's household, the lands he kept for himself, and the lands held by the peasants who owed him service. Understanding the manor is understanding how most people in medieval England actually lived. Picture the landscape. At the centre stands the manor house, modest in the early period, growing grander over generations. A fortified hall, perhaps, with a tower for refuge in troubled times. Nearby cluster the essential buildings of estate management, barns for grain storage, stables for horses, byres for cattle, a mill for grinding flour, a bakehouse, a brewhouse. The parish church stands close by, often built or endowed by the lord's ancestors, its graveyard holding generations of village dead. Spreading outward from this centre lie the fields. Medieval England practiced the open field system, a method of agriculture that organised the arable land into 2 or 3 enormous fields divided into long, narrow strips. Each peasant family held scattered strips across the fields, rather than a single consolidated plot. This distribution ensured that good land and poor land, wet land and dry land, were shared equitably among the community. It also meant that decisions about planting and harvesting had to be made collectively. When to plough, what to sow, when to let the cattle graze the stubble, all of these required communal agreement. The 3-field system, which gradually spread across England during this period, represented a significant agricultural advance. One field would be planted with winter wheat or rye, sown in autumn and harvested the following summer. A second field would be planted with spring crops, oats, barley, peas, or beans. The third field would lie fallow, resting and recovering its fertility, grazed by animals whose manure helped restore the soil. Each year the rotation shifted, so that no field was exhausted by continuous cultivation. The people who worked these fields occupied various positions in a complex hierarchy of unfreedom. At the bottom were the villeins, sometimes called serfs, who were bound to the land they worked. A villein could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. He could not marry his daughter to a man from another estate without paying a fine. When he died, his best beast went to the lord as a death duty called herio. He owed labour service on the lord's demesne, the land the lord kept for his own profit, typically 2 or 3 days each week, and additional days during the busy seasons of ploughing, sowing, and harvest. Yet villeins were not slaves. They held their own land by custom, land that could pass from father to son according to established rules. They could not be arbitrarily dispossessed. They had access to the manor court, where disputes were settled according to local tradition. Their obligations, however burdensome, were defined and limited. A villein knew exactly what he owed, and a lord who demanded more violated custom. Above the villeins stood the freemen, peasants who held their land by rent rather than service. They could move, marry, and dispose of their property more freely. Below the villeins were the cotters and bordars, smallholders with just a cottage and a garden, who survived by hiring out their labour. And beneath everyone, in the earliest period, were the slaves. Though slavery gradually faded from England during the 12th century, the unfree absorbed into the expanding category of villeinage. Women's lives followed the rhythms of this agricultural world, but added domestic burdens on top of fieldwork. Peasant women brewed ale, baked bread, tended gardens, raised children, spun wool, and joined the harvest alongside men. The wife of a villein shared his unfreedom. The widow of a villein might claim rights to his holding, but she also inherited his obligations. Life expectancy was short, perhaps 35 years at birth, and childbirth was dangerous. Many women married multiple times, as husbands died of disease, accident, or simple exhaustion. This was the world that made medieval England function. The great events of politics touched these lives, taxation and war, and the occasional famine when harvests failed. But mostly, the peasants lived within the turning of the seasons, the Christian calendar of feast days and fast days, the eternal cycle of ploughing and sowing and reaping that their ancestors had followed, and their descendants would follow for centuries to come. A day in the fields. You wake before dawn in a house that is really just a single room. The walls are wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with mud and dung, and the roof is thatch that needs repair. You can see a pale star through a gap near the eaves. Your children sleep on straw pallets near the banked fire. Your spouse stirs beside you, coughing in the smoky air. There is no chimney. The smoke from last night's fire has gathered under the roof beams, darkening them with generations of soot. You pull on your tunic, the same rough woolen garment you wear every day, stiff with old sweat and dirt. Washing is a luxury. Water must be carried from the well, and there is always too much work, never enough time. You eat a piece of yesterday's bread, hard now, and a scraping of cheese, and you drink small ale because the water cannot be trusted. Then you step outside into the grey half-light before sunrise. The air smells of wood smoke and manure, of damp earth and growing things. You can hear the lowing of cattle in the Lord's byre, the crowing of a cock somewhere in the village, the distant clang of the church bell, calling the monks to their first prayers. Your breath mists in the cool morning air. Autumn is coming. You can feel it in your bones. Today is a boon day, one of the extra days you owe the Lord during harvest. You join your neighbours at the Demesne fields, where the Lord's reeve waits to direct the work. The wheat stands golden and heavy-headed, ready for cutting. You take your place in the line of reapers, your sickle familiar in your calloused hand. The work begins. Hour after hour, you bend and cut, bend and cut. The motion is ancient, eternal. Your body knows it without thought. The sun climbs higher, and the sweat runs down your back. Your shoulders ache, your lower back burns. Behind you, the women gather the cut stalks and bind them into sheaves. Children carry water to the workers. The Lord's wife, in a gesture of customary generosity, provides bread and ale at midday. You eat sitting in the stubble, too tired to speak much. The bread is better than your own, made with finer flour. The ale is stronger. Around you, your neighbours rest in the same exhausted silence. You have known these people all your life. You were baptised in the same church, married by the same priest, will be buried in the same churchyard. Your great-grandparents worked these same fields. By evening, the light is fading, and your arms tremble with fatigue. The reeve releases you to your own strips, where your own harvest waits, where you will work by moonlight if necessary, because the weather may turn and the grain may rot, and winter is coming, always coming. You walk home through the purple dusk, past the church, past the manor house with its lit windows, past the mill with its great wheel still now in the quiet evening. Your children are already asleep when you return. Your spouse has prepared pottage, the eternal peasant stew of beans and onions, and whatever vegetables remain from the garden. You eat without tasting. You fall onto your palate as into a grave. Tomorrow you will rise and do it all again. This is your life. This is the life of your parents and grandparents. This will be the life of your children and their children's children, world without end, until plague or famine or some unimaginable change breaks the ancient pattern. The great lords quarrel over the throne. The bishops build their soaring cathedrals. None of it touches you much. Here in the village, here in the fields, here where the real work of England happens day after day after day. The cloister's quiet hours. Away from the fields and the villages, behind walls of stone. Another rhythm governed another kind of life. The monasteries of medieval England offered an alternative to the world of labour and lordship, a life dedicated entirely to prayer and the service of God. The monastic day began in darkness. At 2 or 3 in the morning, the bell rang for matins, and the monks rose from their hard beds to file into the church for the first of the day's 8 services. They chanted the psalms by candlelight, their breath visible in the cold air of the unheated choir. After matins came lauds at dawn, then prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before bed. The canonical hours structured every day, every week, every year, a framework of prayer that continued regardless of what happened in the outside world. Between the services, the monks worked. Some laboured in the fields attached to the monastery, for even houses dedicated to prayer needed to eat. Others copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, the writing room where the literary heritage of the ancient world was preserved one painstaking page at a time. The scratch of quills on vellum, The smell of oat gall ink, the ache in fingers cramped from hours of careful lettering. This was how knowledge survived the Dark Ages. Every Bible, every work of classical philosophy, every medical text and legal code that we possess from the ancient world passed through the hands of monastic scribes. The great Benedictine abbeys like Glastonbury, Bury St Edmunds, and St Albans became centres of learning and wealth. They accumulated vast estates through royal grants and pious donations. They maintained schools, hospitals, and hostels for travellers. Their abbots sat in the king's council. Yet the ideal remained withdrawal from the world. The pursuit of holiness through discipline and contemplation. Silence filled the cloister. Monks developed elaborate sign languages to communicate without breaking the rule of quiet. They ate simple meals, while a lector read improving texts aloud. They slept in dormitories, confessed their sins to one another, submitted every aspect of their lives to the authority of their abbot and their rule. In theory, at least. In practice, human nature asserted itself, and reformers regularly complained about lax discipline, personal property, and the temptations of the flesh. Still, the monasteries represented something genuine, the belief that prayer was work, that contemplation served society, that some men and women should dedicate their lives entirely to the soul's salvation. The world outside the walls ploughed and fought and struggled. The monks prayed for them all, knights, and the code of chivalry. The mounted warrior had transformed English warfare at Hastings. In the century that followed, the knight became the dominant figure of medieval military culture, a specialist in mounted combat, whose training began in childhood and whose equipment cost more than most peasants would see in a lifetime. A boy destined for knighthood left his father's household at 7 or 8 years old to serve as a page in another lord's castle. There he learned courtesy and manners, the basics of horsemanship, and the etiquette of noble life. At 14 or so, he became a squire, a knight's personal servant and apprentice. The squire cared for his master's horses, maintained his armour, and accompanied him into battle. He practiced constantly with sword and lance, building the strength and skill that combat demanded. He learned to fight in full armour, to control a warhorse with his knees, while his hands wielded weapons, to charge home against a wall of enemy spears. At 21, if he had proven worthy and could afford the expense, the squire was dubbed a knight. The ceremony varied, but often involved a ritual bath symbolising purification, a night-long vigil in a church, and the actual dubbing, a blow or tap from the flat of a sword delivered by an established knight or lord. The new knight received his sword, his spurs, and the right to bear arms as a member of the warrior aristocracy. The expense was staggering. A warhorse, the destrier, cost as much as a small farm. A suit of mail armour, painstakingly assembled from thousands of interlocking iron rings, represented months of skilled labour. The knight needed multiple horses, spare weapons, servants to attend him on campaign. Only the wealthy could afford to maintain this equipment, which is why knighthood remained tied to landholding. A knight without land was a contradiction in terms. Around this practical military reality, an elaborate culture of chivalry grew. The word itself comes from the French for horse, a reminder of what defined the knight. But chivalry came to mean much more. A code of conduct governing behaviour toward fellow knights, toward women, toward the weak, toward the church. The ideal knight was brave in battle, but merciful to defeated foes. He honoured his word absolutely. He defended the church and protected the helpless. He served his lady with pure devotion. The tournaments that became popular during this period served multiple purposes. They provided training for war, allowing knights to practice their skills in conditions approximating actual combat. They offered opportunities for younger sons and landless knights to win wealth and reputation. They displayed prowess before audiences that included the ladies whose favour knights sought. The tournament field became a stage for the performance of chivalric identity, complete with heraldic devices, ritual challenges, and elaborate pageantry. Of course, the reality of knightly behaviour often fell far short of the ideal. Knights could be brutal, grasping, violent, and cruel. They massacred peasants, abused their power, broke their oaths when convenient. The same men who wept at tales of Lancelot's pure love might beat their wives and burn their tenants' villages. Chivalry was always as much aspiration as description, but the aspiration mattered. The code created a standard against which behaviour could be measured, a vocabulary for praise and condemnation, a framework for imagining what nobility ought to mean. The Charter at Runnymede. John came to the throne in 1199 with a reputation already tarnished. He was the youngest son of Henry II, the brother who had conspired against Richard the Lionheart, the prince whose treachery had become legendary even before he became king. His reign would confirm every suspicion his enemies held. John was intelligent, energetic, and utterly untrustworthy. He quarrelled with the Pope over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury and saw his entire kingdom placed under interdict, the churches closed, the sacraments suspended for 6 long years. He lost Normandy and most of the other French possessions his ancestors had accumulated, earning the nickname Lackland. He taxed his barons ruthlessly to fund failed attempts at reconquest. He abused the feudal rights that gave kings power over the marriages and inheritances of noble families, extracting ruinous payments, seizing lands on pretexts, playing favourites in ways that violated every expectation of just lordship. By 1215, the barons had had enough. A group of them, primarily from the north of England, renounced their allegiance and took up arms. They captured London. John, finding himself without sufficient military support, agreed to negotiate. The meeting took place in June, in a meadow called Runnymede beside the Thames. There, under pressure from armed rebellion, John set his seal to a document that would become known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. The Charter was not a constitution in any modern sense. It was a practical attempt to address specific grievances, a treaty between a cornered king and his rebellious barons. Most of its 63 clauses dealt with feudal technicalities that have long since lost their relevance. Yet certain clauses pointed toward principles that would grow over centuries into foundations of English liberty. No free man was to be arrested, imprisoned, dispossessed, or destroyed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Justice was not to be sold, delayed, or denied. The king himself was bound by the law. These principles, revolutionary in their implications, were buried among clauses about fish weirs and debts to Jews and the rights of widows. But they were there. John had no intention of honouring his promises. Within weeks, he appealed to the Pope to annul the Charter, arguing that it had been extorted under duress. The Pope agreed. Civil war erupted. John died the following year of dysentery contracted during a military campaign, and his 9-year-old son became Henry III. The regents who governed in Henry's name reissued Magna Carta, modified and shortened as a gesture of reconciliation. They reissued it again and again. By the end of the 13th century, it had been confirmed over 40 times. The Charter took on a life far beyond its origins. Lawyers and parliamentarians of later centuries would mine its clauses for ammunition against royal overreach. They would read into its feudal language principles of limited government that the barons of 1215 could never have imagined. Whether this was creative interpretation or authentic recovery of original meaning, scholars still debate. What matters is that Magna Carta became a symbol, a touchstone, a proof text for the argument that even kings must govern under law, the rise of Parliament. The word Parliament comes from the French parler, to speak. In its earliest form, a parliament was simply an occasion when the king summoned his great lords to discuss matters of state, to give counsel, and to consent to taxation. Such gatherings had precedents stretching back before the conquest. What changed in the 13th century was the gradual formalization of these assemblies and, crucially, the inclusion of representatives from beyond the ranks of the great nobility. The transformation accelerated during another period of crisis. Henry III, the boy king who inherited John's troubles, grew into a man whose taste for expensive foreign favourites alienated his own barons almost as thoroughly as his father had done. By the 1260s, England stood again on the brink of civil war. This time, the baronial opposition found a leader of remarkable vision. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, was himself a Frenchman, son of a crusader, famous for his brutal suppression of heresy in southern France. He had married the king's sister and become one of the great lords of England. He was also, by the standards of his day, something of a radical. When war came, and Montfort captured the king at the Battle of Lewes in 1264, he found himself ruling England in Henry's name. He needed to legitimise his position. In January of 1265, Montfort summoned a parliament unlike any that had met before. He called not only the great barons and bishops, but also 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses from every significant town. For the first time, the commons of England, the middling ranks of landowners and urban merchants, had a voice in national affairs. The assembly met, conducted its business, and dispersed. Montfort himself died later that year, defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham. His body mutilated by the royalists who hated him. The rebellion collapsed, but the precedent survived. Henry's son, the warrior King Edward I, recognised the usefulness of representative assemblies. If taxes were to be collected efficiently, it helped to have the consent of those who would actually pay them. Sending knights and burgesses home to explain what had been decided created support for royal policy. Consulting the realm gave legitimacy to government action. Edward summoned parliaments regularly, and by the end of his reign, the model parliament of 1295 had established a template that would evolve over centuries into the institution we know today. Parliament in its medieval form was not a legislature. It did not make laws in the modern sense. It was a high court, a point of contact between king and kingdom, an occasion for the redress of grievances, a mechanism for consenting to taxation. The king could still govern largely without it. The great lords still mattered, far more than the humble knights and burgesses who crowded into the chapter house at Westminster. Yet something important had begun. The principle that the king should govern with counsel and consent, that significant decisions required broader legitimacy than royal will alone, had taken institutional form. The talking would continue, the century turns cold. The 13th century had been an age of expansion. Population grew, new lands came under the plough, villages multiplied across the English countryside. The great cathedrals rose toward heaven. It seemed, to those who lived through it, that the good times might continue indefinitely. They were wrong. The first signs of trouble came from the sky. Beginning around 1300, the climate of northern Europe began to shift. The medieval warm period, which had blessed the previous centuries with mild winters and reliable harvests, gave way to something colder and wetter. Summers grew shorter. The rains came at the wrong times. The growing season contracted. These changes were gradual, almost imperceptible year to year, but their cumulative effect would prove devastating. England, in 1300, was more densely populated than it would be again for centuries. The expansion of the previous generations had pushed cultivation onto marginal lands, hillsides, and heavy clays that produced adequate yields in good years but failed when conditions turned poor. There was little margin for error. A single bad harvest meant hunger. 2 bad harvests meant famine. 3 meant catastrophe. In 1315, the rains began in spring and did not stop. They fell through the planting season, through the summer, into the autumn. The crops rotted in the fields. What grain could be harvested was damp and prone to mould. Across England and across all of northern Europe, the harvest failed almost completely. The Great Famine had begun. For 3 years, from 1315 to 1317, the rains continued and the harvests failed. Prices for grain rose to levels that put bread beyond the reach of the poor. People ate their seed corn, their draft animals, their dogs and cats. They stripped bark from trees and boiled leather for whatever nourishment it might provide. Contemporary chronicles report parents abandoning children, prisoners eating their cellmates, bodies lying unburied in the streets. The scale of death is impossible to determine precisely, but historians estimate that 10 to 15% of the English population perished. The famine eventually passed. The rains relented. The harvests recovered. But something had changed. The limitless optimism of the high medieval period had received its first great shock. The population stabilized and even declined slightly in the following decades, as people married later and had fewer children. The most marginal lands were abandoned. A generation grew up knowing that the world could turn cruel without warning, that abundance was not guaranteed, that death could come for anyone. They did not know that far worse was coming. Ships from the east. In the autumn of 1347, a Genoese trading fleet limped into the harbour of Messina, on the island of Sicily. The ships had sailed from Caffa, a trading post on the Black Sea, fleeing a Mongol siege. The Genoese sailors were dying. Strange swellings had appeared in their groins and armpits, hard lumps the size of eggs or apples that turned black and oozed blood and pus. Fever consumed them. Many were already dead. The Sicilian authorities, horrified, ordered the ships back to sea. But it was too late. The plague had come to Europe. The disease moved with terrifying speed along the trade routes that connected the medieval world. It reached the French coast in early 1348. By summer, it had crossed the Channel. In August, a ship from Gascony brought infected sailors to the Dorset port of Melcombe Regis, and the Black Death entered England. The name would come later. Contemporaries called it the Great Pestilence, the Great Mortality, the Blue Sickness. They watched it spread from port to port, town to town, village to village, seemingly unstoppable, utterly incomprehensible. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding contagion as we know it. Physicians blamed corrupted air, unusual planetary alignments, earthquakes that had released poisonous vapours from the earth. The Church saw divine punishment for human sinfulness. The common people blamed foreigners, Jews, lepers, anyone who might serve as a scapegoat for cosmic injustice. The disease took multiple forms. We now know it as Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas on black rats. The bubonic form, marked by the characteristic swellings or buboes, killed perhaps half of those infected, usually within a week. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, spread directly from person to person through coughs and breath. It was almost universally fatal within 2 or 3 days. The septicemic form, which overwhelmed the bloodstream, could kill within hours. Through the autumn of 1348 and into the following year, the plague swept across England. It moved fastest in the crowded conditions of towns and monasteries, where people lived in close proximity and rats thrived in stored grain. But it reached the countryside too, carried by travellers, by merchants, by the ordinary movements of people going about their lives. By the time the first wave subsided in late 1349, the world had been transformed beyond recognition, the world unmade. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. Modern historians, working from manor records, tax rolls, and ecclesiastical documents, estimate that between 40 and 60% of England's population died in the first outbreak of the Black Death. Some communities lost 3/4 of their inhabitants. Some vanished entirely, their names surviving only in the records that document their destruction. Imagine a village of 200 souls in the summer of 1348. They have heard rumours of a terrible sickness in the south. But rumours are always circulating, and life must continue. The harvest needs to be brought in, the Lord's dues must be paid, children must be fed. Then someone falls ill. Perhaps a merchant passing through. Perhaps a villager returning from market in the nearest town. Within days, the swellings appear. Within a week, the first deaths. The priest comes to administer last rites, to hear confessions, to comfort the dying. He touches the sick. He breathes the same air. He brings the disease back to the rectory. And from there it spreads to everyone who comes to church, which is everyone in the village. There is nowhere to flee, and flight only spreads the contagion further. There is no treatment that helps. The physician's remedies of bleeding and purging likely killed as many as the disease itself. The dying happens faster than the living can manage. Proper burials become impossible. The priest dies, and there is no one to perform the sacraments. Families abandon their sick members out of terror. Parents flee from children. The bonds that hold society together dissolve under the pressure of overwhelming fear. Bodies lie in houses for days before anyone dares enter to remove them. Mass graves appear at the edges of villages. Long trenches where the dead are tumbled without ceremony, without coffins, without the prayers that every Christian soul deserves. When autumn comes, the fields lie unharvested. The cattle wander untended. The silence that settles over the countryside is unlike anything anyone has ever known. Those who survive often wish they had not. A chronicler at Rochester wrote that the living were barely able to bury the dead, and that barely anyone dared to have any contact with the sick. At the Abbey of Mow in Yorkshire, the community that had numbered 42 monks and 7 lay brothers, before the plague was reduced to 10 monks and no lay brothers. Similar devastation struck every religious house in England. The church, which should have provided comfort in the crisis, was itself shattered by the catastrophe. The social effects rippled outward in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. The massive death toll created an acute labour shortage. Fields lay fallow because there were not enough hands to work them. Rents collapsed because there were not enough tenants to pay them. Wages for those who survived rose dramatically in defiance of all custom and expectation. The careful hierarchies of the old order, built on the assumption of abundant labour, began to crack. The plague would return. It came again in 1361, killing many of those born since the first outbreak who had no acquired resistance. It returned in 1369, in 1375, and periodically for centuries afterward. Each recurrence prevented the population from recovering. England in 1400 had perhaps half the population of England in 1300. The landscape itself had changed, emptied of people, studded with abandoned villages, whose outlines can still be traced in aerial photographs today. The medieval world did not end with the Black Death, but it never recovered. Everything that followed bore the mark of that catastrophe, the strange new world that emerged from the mass graves of the 14th century. In the shadow of death, Father Thomas has been priest of this village for 11 years. He baptized most of the children. He married their parents. He buried their grandparents in the churchyard, where his own bones will someday rest. He knows every soul in his care by name, knows their sins and struggles, knows which marriages are unhappy and which children go hungry when the harvest is poor. Now he watches them die. The first case appeared a fortnight ago. A travelling tinker who collapsed in the market square. Father Thomas gave him last rites in the blacksmith's barn. Not knowing what he was seeing, not understanding that he was inviting death into his village. Within 3 days, the blacksmith's family was sick. Within a week, a dozen households. Now he cannot count the dead. He moves through the village like a man in a nightmare, his holy water and his oils, his prayers worn smooth by endless repetition. The swellings are horrible to see, the black eruptions of corrupted flesh, the stench of bodies rotting while their owners still breathe. He has stopped fearing for himself. Either God will preserve him, or God will take him. Either way, he must do his duty. The widow Marjorie dies clutching her rosary, her son's already cold beside her. John the miller dies cursing God, and Father Thomas prays for his soul anyway. Little Agnes, 7 years old, dies asking for her mother, who died the day before. The gravedigger dies, and Father Thomas digs the graves himself, his blistered hands bleeding into the soil. He finds himself speaking to God with an honesty he has never permitted himself before. Why this village? Why these people, no worse than any others, many of them genuinely good? Why the children, innocent of any sin that could merit such punishment? The theology he learned offers answers: original sin, divine mystery, the inscrutability of providence. The answers feel hollow in the charnel house his parish has become. On the 18th day, Father Thomas wakes with a fever. He feels his neck, his armpits. Nothing yet. Perhaps it is only exhaustion. He rises anyway, for there are still living souls who need him. He walks to the church to say the morning mass, and he finds only 3 people waiting. 3, where there should be 60. He says the mass anyway. He lifts the host toward heaven, in hands that tremble now with more than age. He speaks the words of consecration that transform bread into divine flesh, and he wonders if God is listening, if God has ever listened, if God is there at all. He does not die. Some do not, and no one knows why. When the plague passes 3 weeks later, Father Thomas counts the survivors. 23 souls remain from a village of 140, he buries the last of the dead. He says prayers over graves he cannot even mark, because there is no one left who knows who lies where. He will live another 12 years. This priest who walked through the shadow of death. He will rebuild his congregation from survivors and newcomers. He will baptize new children, marry new couples, bury those who die of ordinary causes. He will never speak of what he saw in the autumn of 1349. There are no words, there will never be words. The silence after. In the years after the pestilence, a strange quiet settled over the English countryside. The sounds that had filled the medieval world, the shouts of workers in the fields, the lowing of cattle, the ringing of church bells, calling the faithful to prayer, all seemed muted now, diminished, echoing across a landscape that had become too large for its remaining inhabitants. Walk through that countryside in the decade after the plague, and you would see the evidence everywhere. Fields once cultivated, now returning to scrub and woodland. Cottages standing empty, their thatch rotting, their wattle walls crumbling. The wooden ploughs, abandoned where their owners had left them, rusting quietly into the earth. Churches with graveyards freshly expanded, the mounded earth still raw and bare, where grass had not yet grown to cover the mass burials. The birds returned first. They sang in orchards where no one came to harvest the fruit. They nested in the eaves of houses where no smoke rose from the hearths. The deer grew bold, venturing from the forests into fields where no farmer came to chase them away. The wild reclaimed what the dead had surrendered. The silence was not complete, of course. Survivors worked the land, though they chose the best fields now and left the marginal lands to fallow. Markets still met, though the crowds were thinner. Lords still demanded rents, though they found fewer tenants to pay them. The church still prayed for the living and the dead, though the lists of the dead had grown impossibly long. But something had broken, some essential confidence that the world made sense and would continue as it always had. People who had lived through the pestilence carried a knowledge that could not be unlearned, that everything they loved could be taken in a matter of weeks, that no prayers would save them, that death could come as a thief in the night and steal half the world, while the other half watched helplessly. The silence was the sound of that knowledge settling into the bones of a civilization. The peasants' rise. The catastrophe changed everything, including the ancient balance between lord and peasant. Before the plague, labour had been abundant and land relatively scarce. A villain who fled his manor could be replaced easily enough. The lord held all the power. After the plague, the equation reversed. Land was plentiful, labour was desperately short. A peasant who could work had become suddenly valuable. Wages rose. They rose despite the efforts of lords to hold them down, despite statutes and proclamations, despite threats of punishment. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers to their manors. It was widely ignored. Peasants fled to lords who would pay more. They bargained for better terms. They discovered that their labour had power. The attempts to enforce the old order only bred resentment. Royal commissioners travelled the countryside, arresting workers who demanded higher wages, punishing lords who paid them. The poll taxes of the late 1370s added injury to insult, demanding the same payment from poor cotters as from wealthy merchants. The tax of 1381, set at 3 times the rate of the original levy, proved to be the breaking point. In May of 1381, resistance to the tax collectors in Essex sparked an uprising that spread with astonishing speed. Within weeks, peasant armies were marching on London from Essex and Kent, gathering strength as they went. They were not mere mobs. They had leaders, organisation, and demands. They wanted the abolition of serfdom, the end of the poll tax, the dismissal of the king's corrupt ministers, and access to the royal person himself. The rebels found allies among the lower clergy, among the urban poor, among all those who had suffered under the weight of a system that seemed designed to crush them. They attacked symbols of lordship and legal oppression. They burned manor records that documented their obligations. They killed lawyers and royal officials. They opened prisons and freed the inmates. They marched under banners, proclaiming their cause and sang songs that would be remembered for centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The question, drawn from a popular sermon, cut to the heart of the social order. If all people descended from common ancestors, how could some be born to rule and others to serve? The question had no good answer, and the lords who heard it knew it. By June, the rebels held London. The young king, Richard II, barely 14 years old, found himself effectively a prisoner in the Tower. His ministers cowered beside him. Outside, the flames from burning buildings lit the night sky. The greatest city in England had fallen to men who had been, a few weeks earlier, the voiceless and powerless base of the social pyramid. Wat Tyler at Smithfield. The leader of the Kentish rebels was a man named Wat Tyler. We know almost nothing about him. Before the revolt, perhaps a Tyler by trade, perhaps a veteran of the French wars, certainly a man of considerable charisma and organisational ability. For a few weeks in the summer of 1381, he was the most powerful commoner in England. On June 15th, Tyler rode to meet the king at Smithfield, just outside the city walls. It was the second such meeting in 2 days. The first, at Mile End, had produced royal charters promising the abolition of serfdom and pardons for the rebels. But Tyler wanted more. He wanted the total dismantling of lordship, the redistribution of church wealth, the end of all the ancient distinctions that divided English society into those who commanded and those who obeyed. The accounts of what happened next are confused and contradictory, written by chroniclers who hated the rebels and wished to justify their destruction. What seems clear is that Tyler approached the king with less deference than royal dignity demanded. He may have reached out to touch Richard, and kees, he may have spoken insolently. He may have rinsed his mouth with water in the royal presence, a gesture of contempt or perhaps simply thirst on a hot June day. The Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, saw his moment. He drew a short sword and struck Tyler in the neck. Other royal attendants rushed in with their weapons. Tyler, mortally wounded, managed to ride a short distance before falling from his horse. He was dragged into the nearby church of St. Bartholomew and then hauled out again to be beheaded in front of the crowd. The rebel army, thousands strong, stood watching. They had seen their leader murdered under flag of truce. For a moment, the situation balanced on a knife edge. A volley of arrows could have ended the Plantagenet dynasty right there. Instead, the 14-year-old king rode forward alone, directly toward the armed and angry crowd. "Sirs, will you shoot your king?" Richard cried out. "I am your captain. Follow me." It was an extraordinary gamble, and it worked. The peasants, conditioned by generations of deference to royal authority, hesitated. Richard led them away from Smithfield, toward the fields beyond, where his forces were gathering. By the time the rebels understood they had been outmaneuvered, it was too late. The royal army arrived. The revolt collapsed. The reprisals were swift and brutal. Richard repudiated every concession he had made. The royal charters were declared void. The leaders of the revolt were hunted down and executed. When a delegation of peasants from Essex came to remind the king of his promises, Richard reportedly replied, "Serfs ye are, and serfs ye shall remain." Yet the king's words proved only partially prophetic. Serfdom did not end overnight, but it continued its slow decline in the decades that followed. The poll tax was never attempted again. The lords learned that pushing the commons too hard brought consequences they could not control. The peasants' revolt failed in its immediate objectives, but succeeded in drawing a line that future generations of rulers would remember. A new world grows in the ruins. The old order crumbled slowly, like a great cathedral whose foundations have been undermined. Villenage did not disappear in a single proclamation, but eroded away across the 15th century. Lords found it easier to accept money rents than to enforce labour services from resentful tenants who might flee at the first opportunity. The bonds of serfdom loosened, then frayed, then dissolved into the general transformation of rural society. In place of the old system, something new emerged. The yeoman farmer, a free peasant who owned or leased enough land to prosper by his own labour, became an increasingly important figure in the English countryside. These were men who could afford to build solid houses, to accumulate modest wealth, to send their sons to learn trades, or even to acquire education. They served on juries, held local offices, and formed the backbone of a middling class that had scarcely existed before the plague. The landlords adapted too. Some converted their estates to sheep farming, which required far less labour than grain cultivation. English wool, already famous throughout Europe, flooded the continental markets. The wealth from wool built manor houses and endowed churches. It also transformed the landscape, as enclosures replaced the old open fields with hedged pastures where sheep grazed in their thousands. The towns grew relatively more important as the countryside emptied. Urban wages remained high, drawing migrants from the rural areas. Craft guilds exercised increasing control over production and trade. The cloth industry expanded, adding value to English wool before export. A commercial economy based on money and markets, rather than customary obligation, displaced the older patterns of manorial self-sufficiency. Even the church changed. The clergy who survived the plague were often poorly trained replacements for the learned priests who had died. The old certainties of faith had been shaken by the evident failure of prayer to stop the pestilence. New forms of piety emerged, more personal, more anxious, more focused on death and judgment. The elaborate funeral monuments of the late medieval period, with their grim depictions of decomposing corpses, spoke to a society that had looked into the grave and never quite looked away. The world that emerged from the 14th century was not the world that had entered it. The confident hierarchies of the high medieval period had given way to something more fluid, more uncertain, more recognizably modern. The catastrophe had been real, the suffering immense, the losses irreplaceable. But in the ruins, new growth had begun. The survivors and their children would build something different from what had been destroyed, something that would eventually carry England toward the transformations of the early modern age. The 100 Years' War. While England struggled with plague and rebellion, its kings pursued a dream across the Channel. The 100 Years' War, that sprawling conflict between England and France, had begun in 1337 and would not truly end until 1453. It shaped English identity, drained English resources, and ultimately ended in English defeat. But along the way, it produced some of the most celebrated military triumphs in English history. The war began with a dynastic claim. When the last Capetian king of France died without a male heir in 1328, Edward III of England argued that the crown should pass to him through his mother, Isabella, daughter of the French king Philip the Fair. The French nobility disagreed, selecting Philip of Valois instead. Edward initially accepted this decision, even doing homage to Philip for his French lands. But a decade later, when disputes over Gascony and Flanders pushed the two kingdoms toward conflict, Edward revived his claim and declared himself the rightful king of France. The early decades of the war brought stunning English victories. At Crécy, in 1346, Edward's army faced a French force perhaps 3 times its size. The battle should have been a disaster. Instead, it became a demonstration of how completely warfare had changed. The English longbow, a weapon that could send a cloth-yard shaft through armour at 200 paces, devastated the flower of French chivalry. Wave after wave of mounted knights charged the English lines. Wave after wave fell before the arrow storm. By nightfall, thousands of French nobles lay dead on the field, including the blind King John of Bohemia, who had insisted on being led into battle and died with his reins tied to the knights beside him. The longbow was not a new weapon, but the English had perfected its use as no other nation had. Training began in childhood. English law required every able-bodied man to practice at the butts on Sundays after church. A skilled archer could loose 12 arrows in a minute, far faster than any crossbow. At Crécy, at Poitiers 10 years later, at Agincourt 2 generations after that, the English longbowmen proved that disciplined infantry could destroy cavalry charges that should have swept them from the field. But victories on the battlefield did not translate into lasting conquest. The French kingdom was vast, its population many times that of England. The English could win battles, but could not hold territory. They could capture the French king, as they did at Poitiers in 1356, and still find themselves fighting the same war decades later. The pattern repeated endlessly. English chevauchés burning and pillaging across the French countryside, truces and treaties that settled nothing, ransoms and ransoms and ransoms, draining wealth from both kingdoms. The costs were enormous. Parliament granted tax after tax to fund campaigns that produced glory, but rarely permanent gain. The soldiers who returned brought skills of violence that they sometimes turned against their own countrymen. The French peasantry suffered most of all, caught between armies that lived off the land and cared nothing for those who worked it. Entire regions were depopulated, not by plague alone, but by the systematic destruction of decades of warfare. By the early 15th century, the war had settled into an exhausted stalemate. France was divided between factions, the Mad King, Charles VI, unable to rule, his relatives fighting over the regency. England had its own troubles, the usurpation of Henry IV, rebellions in Wales and the north, a treasury perpetually empty. The great age of English victories seemed to have passed. Then a young king came to the throne with something to prove. The muddy field at Agincourt. You are an English archer in the army of Henry V, standing in a freshly ploughed field in northern France on the morning of October 25th, 1415. The Feast of Saints, Crispin and Crispinian, the calendar says. You have been marching for weeks, sick with dysentery, hungry, far from home. The French army blocks the road ahead, and there are so many of them that the chronicles will struggle to count their banners. You have not eaten properly in days. Your bowels cramp and twist. The leather bracer on your forearm is cracked and stiff. Your bowstring, coiled safe and dry beneath your helmet, is the most precious thing you own. Around you stand your companions, 5,000 or 6,000 Englishmen, facing perhaps 20,000 French. The mathematics are simple and terrifying. The field between the armies is wet. It rained heavily in the night, and the newly turned earth has become a sea of mud. You plant your sharpened stake in the ground before you, angled forward to receive a cavalry charge. Your hands know this work. They have done it before, at practice if not in battle, but today is not practice. The French are magnificent. Even from here, you can see the glitter of their armour, the bright silk of their surcoats, the forest of lances rising above the mass of mounted knights. They are the flower of French chivalry, the greatest warriors of the greatest kingdom in Christendom. They have come to avenge Crécy and Poitiers, to wipe away the stain of those defeats, to crush this ragged English army and take its king for ransom. King Henry rides along the line, speaking to his men. You cannot hear the words, but you see faces lift as he passes, see spines straighten, see something kindle in eyes that had been dull with exhaustion. He is 28 years old, your king, and he has gambled everything on this campaign. If he loses today, he loses his crown, his kingdom, perhaps his life. The French advance begins. They come on foot at first, the dismounted men-at-arms struggling through the mud, their heavy armour dragging at every step. You knock an arrow, you draw, you loose. The shaft vanishes into the distant mass of armoured men. Around you, 5,000 bows sing the same note. The sky darkens with English arrows. The French fall. They fall and rise and fall again. The mud clutches at their feet. Their visors fog with their own breath. They cannot see the arrows that strike them. They trip over fallen comrades and cannot rise again, pushed face down into the muck by the press of men behind. The cavalry charges that should have swept you away founder in the churned earth, horses screaming, knights drowning in mud that swallows them like quicksand. Hours pass, your arm burns, your fingers bleed, your quiver empties, and you pull arrows from the ground, from the bodies of the fallen, from anywhere you can find them. The killing goes on and on. The French keep coming, and the French keep dying. The mud turns red, then brown, then black with blood. The Sisty, when it ends, when the survivors flee, and the English stand victorious, on a field carpeted with French dead, you can barely lift your bow. The king orders the prisoners killed when a rumour spreads of a French counterattack. You are too tired to feel horror at the command. You are too tired to feel anything at all. You have won one of the most famous victories in English history. You will never forget the screaming of the horses or the sucking sound of the mud. You will never escape the smell of blood and churned earth that fills your nostrils even now, years later, when you wake in the darkness of an English night and find yourself still standing in that terrible field. The Maid and the Lost Cause. Agincourt should have ended the war. Henry V exploited his victory brilliantly, conquering Normandy, allying with the Burgundian faction, and forcing the mad French king to acknowledge him as heir to the French throne. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to unite the two crowns under English rule. Henry married the French princess Catherine. Their son would be king of both realms. Then everything fell apart. Henry died in 1422, probably of dysentery contracted during a siege. He was 35 years old. His son, the infant Henry VI, inherited two kingdoms and the capacity to rule neither. The regents who governed in his name quarrelled among themselves. The French Dauphin, disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, refused to accept his exclusion and maintained a rival court south of the Loire. The war dragged on, but the momentum had shifted. English resources were stretched thin. The conquered territories required garrisons that bled manpower from the field armies. The French gradually found their footing, their leadership, their will to resist. Then came the strangest chapter in the entire conflict. In 1429, a peasant girl from the village of Domremy presented herself to the Dauphin's court. She claimed that the voices of saints had commanded her to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, and she would change everything. The military impact of Joan's intervention remains debated. She led no armies in the conventional sense, held no command authority, understood nothing of strategy or tactics, but she gave the demoralized French forces something they had lacked for a generation: the belief that God was on their side, that victory was possible, that the English could be beaten. Within months of her arrival, Joan had lifted the siege of Orléans, won a string of improbable victories, and escorted the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation as Charles VII. The English, who had seemed invincible, suddenly looked vulnerable. The tide of the war turned. Joan herself was captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, sold to the English, tried for heresy and witchcraft, and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. She was 19 years old, but her death did not reverse what she had begun. The French continued to advance. Normandy fell in 1450. Gascony, English for 3 centuries, fell in 1453. By the time the guns fell silent, England had lost everything it had fought for except the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War was over, and England had lost. The dream of a dual monarchy, of an English king ruling France, had died in the mud of 100 battlefields. The veterans came home to an England that had changed in their absence, to lords who were already turning their violence against one another. Roses red and white. Henry VI grew to manhood, but never truly grew into kingship. He was pious, gentle, scholarly, and entirely unsuited to the brutal realities of 15th century politics. He suffered periods of mental incapacity during which he could not speak, could not recognize his own wife and child, could not perform the most basic functions of government. The great lords who surrounded him filled the vacuum of power with their own ambitions. The trouble centered on the succession. Henry had no children for the first decade of his marriage, and the heir presumptive was Richard, Duke of York, a great-grandson of Edward III, with a claim to the throne arguably stronger than Henry's own. When Henry finally produced a son in 1453, Richard of York found himself displaced from the line of succession and surrounded by enemies at court. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, hated him. The court faction led by the Duke of Somerset worked to destroy him. Richard concluded that his only safety lay in power. The conflict that followed became known as the Wars of the Roses, a name coined centuries later from the supposed badges of the rival houses: the White Rose of York, the Red Rose of Lancaster. In truth, the symbolism was a later invention, but the bloodshed was real. The first battle came at St Albans in 1455, a skirmish in the streets of the town that left Somerset dead and the king a prisoner of the Yorkist lords. It should have been a resolution. Instead, it was a beginning. Queen Margaret rallied the Lancastrian cause. The conflict escalated from political manoeuvring to open warfare. For the next 30 years, the English nobility tore itself apart. Battles followed battles in a dreary succession. Blore Heath, Ludford Bridge, Northampton, Wakefield, Mortimer's Cross, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury. The names blur together, a calendar of slaughter. The old rules of chivalric warfare, which had limited the killing of noble prisoners, broke down completely. The losing side in each engagement saw its leaders executed, their lands confiscated, their families attainted. Richard of York himself died at Wakefield in 1460, his army surprised and overwhelmed by Lancastrian forces. His head, adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his pretensions, was displayed on the gates of York. But his son Edward proved a more formidable warrior. Young, tall, charismatic and ruthless, Edward of York won a crushing victory at Towton in 1461, in what remains the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. He entered London as Edward IV, and Henry VI fled into exile. The Lancastrian cause seemed finished. It was not the kingmaker's game. The man who had made Edward king was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the greatest magnate in England, whose wealth and connections had tipped the balance toward York. History would remember him as the kingmaker. The name was apt. He would make kings, unmake them, and die trying to make another. Warwick expected gratitude and deference from the young king he had elevated. He received neither. Edward proved to have a will of his own, and the clash came over marriage. Warwick was negotiating a French alliance sealed by Edward's marriage to a French princess. While these negotiations proceeded, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of no great family, a woman whose Lancastrian connections and numerous relatives threatened to displace Warwick from his position of dominance. The revelation of the marriage humiliated Warwick before the courts of Europe. The Woodville family swarmed into positions of power and profit, marrying their sons and daughters into the highest nobility, accumulating offices and influence with dizzying speed. Warwick found himself marginalised, his counsel ignored, his authority undermined. His response was rebellion. In 1469, Warwick allied with Edward's own brother George, Duke of Clarence, captured the king, Hasdhu, and attempted to rule through him as he had once ruled through Henry VI. But Edward proved impossible to control. He escaped, rallied his supporters, and forced Warwick to flee the country. Then came the most dramatic reversal of all. Warwick, the great champion of York, made alliance with Margaret of Anjou, the implacable enemy of everything he had fought for. The price was his daughter's marriage to the Lancastrian Prince Edward and his commitment to restore Henry VI to the throne. In 1470, Warwick invaded England, drove Edward IV into exile, and restored the bewildered Henry to a crown he had lost 9 years before. The readeption, as this brief Lancastrian restoration was called, lasted barely 6 months. Edward returned from Burgundy in 1471, with fresh troops and fresh determination. At Barnet, in fog so thick that men could barely see their opponents, the Yorkist army destroyed Warwick's forces. The kingmaker died on the field, cut down as he fled. At Tewkesbury 3 weeks later, the Lancastrian cause died with him. Prince Edward was killed in the battle, or its aftermath. Henry VI, helpless in the Tower of London, was murdered within days of Edward's triumphant return. Edward IV ruled for another 12 years, the last of them relatively peaceful. He proved a capable administrator, restored royal finances, and suppressed the disorder that had plagued the kingdom. When he died in 1483, aged only 40, he left 2 young sons and a kingdom that seemed finally at rest. It was an illusion. Bosworth Field. Edward's elder son was 12 years old when his father died. He was proclaimed King Edward V, but he never ruled. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, appointed himself protector and then moved with terrifying speed to seize the throne for himself. Within 3 months of Edward IV's death, Gloucester had arrested the young king's maternal relatives, declared the late king's marriage invalid and his children illegitimate, and taken the crown as Richard III. The boy king and his younger brother were lodged in the Tower of London and never seen again. What happened to them remains one of the great mysteries of English history. Most contemporaries believed, and most historians agree, that Richard had them murdered. Richard III has come down through history as a villain, the crook-backed monster of Shakespeare's imagination. The reality was more complex. He was an experienced soldier, a capable administrator, and in some respects a reforming king. But the shadow of the princes in the Tower hung over his reign from the beginning. Rebellions flared. Great lords who had served the Yorkist cause looked for alternatives. They found one in an unlikely figure across the sea. Henry Tudor was the great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt, but through an illegitimate line that had been specifically excluded from the succession, his claim to the throne was thin to the point of transparency. What he had was not hereditary right, but opposition to Richard. Lancastrian exiles, disaffected Yorkists, and anyone with grievances against the new regime gradually coalesced around this obscure Welsh nobleman living in exile at the court of Brittany. In August of 1485, Henry landed in Wales with a small army of French mercenaries and English exiles. He marched east through Wales and into England, gathering strength as he went, though less strength than he had hoped. Richard moved to intercept him. The armies met at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22nd. The battle itself was decided by treachery. Lord Stanley and his brother, commanding a significant force, had avoided committing to either side. Both Richard and Henry had reasons to doubt their loyalty. When the fighting began, the Stanleys held back, watching, waiting. Richard saw Henry's position and made a desperate gamble. He led a cavalry charge directly at his rival, hoping to end the war with a single blow. The charge came close to succeeding. Richard cut down Henry's standard-bearer and fought his way toward the pretender himself. But the Stanleys finally chose their moment. They threw their fresh troops against Richard's exposed flank. The king's men fled or fell. Richard offered a horse for escape, reportedly cried out that he would die King of England. He did. His body, stripped and battered, was thrown across a horse and carried to Leicester for public display. Henry Tudor took the crown as Henry VII. The Stanley, who had stayed neutral, longest placed the circlet, found in a thorn bush after the battle, upon his head. The Wars of the Roses were over. The medieval period of English history was ending. A new dynasty would build a new kind of kingdom on the bones of the old nobility that had destroyed itself across 30 years of civil war. The monasteries stand silent. In the final decades of the medieval age, the great abbeys of England still kept their ancient rhythm. The bells still rang for matins in the darkness before dawn. The monks still filed into their choir stalls to chant the psalms their predecessors had chanted for 500 years. The candles still flickered before altars worn smooth by generations of reverent hands. But something had changed. The monasteries that had once drawn the best and brightest of English youth now struggled to fill their dormitories. The fervour that had built fountains and revaults, that had sent Cistercian pioneers into the Yorkshire wilderness to clear forests and drain swamps for the glory of God, had cooled to routine. The great estates still produced their rents. The pilgrims still came to venerate the shrines, but the fire had dimmed. Walk through a monastery cloister in the reign of Henry VII, and you would find comfort rather than austerity. The refectory served better food than the rule prescribed. The dormitories had been divided into private chambers. The abbots lived like lords, with their own households, their own hunting parks, their own concerns that had little to do with prayer. Visitation records from the period reveal communities going through the motions, observing the forms while the spirit had quietly departed. The monks themselves were often good men, devout in their fashion, faithful to their vows as they understood them. They did not know that they were the last generation. They did not know that within 50 years, their buildings would be ruins, their communities scattered, their way of life erased from England forever. They rose for matins, they chanted the psalms, they prayed for the souls of the living and the dead. The bells rang on. What endured in stone? The cathedrals remain, Canterbury and York, Durham and Salisbury, Lincoln and Wells and Winchester. Their towers still rise above the English landscape, as they have risen for 8 centuries. Their naves still echo with footsteps and whispered prayers. The light still falls through windows that medieval glaziers fitted, pane by pane, into tracery of carved stone. Stand in the nave of any great English cathedral, and you stand where medieval people stood. The same columns soar above you. The same vaulted ceiling draws your eye upward toward heaven. The same worn stones bear the marks of countless feet that walked this path before you. The bishops who commissioned these buildings, the masons who raised them, the congregations who worshipped in them across the centuries, all are gone. The stone remembers. The castles endure as well, though many now as ruins. The Tower of London still guards the Thames, its white keep gleaming as it gleamed when Norman kings held court within. Windsor still crowns its hill above the river. But others have crumbled. Kenilworth with its shattered walls, reflected in still water, Tintagel clinging to its Cornish cliff, Corfe, a broken crown on its Dorset hilltop. These ruins speak as eloquently as the intact survivors. They speak of power that seemed eternal and proved merely long. The parish churches may be the most persistent inheritance of all. In nearly every English village, a medieval church still stands at the heart of the community. Some are grand, built with the profits of the wool trade. Others are humble, barely more than a nave and a chancel and a squat tower. But they connect the present to the past in an unbroken chain. The font where babies are baptized today may have baptized babies in the reign of Edward I. The walls have heard prayers in languages that have themselves become history, words that survived. The medieval centuries gave England something more enduring than stone. A literature, a language, a voice that would echo through all the ages that followed. The greatest monument of that literary inheritance is Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote in the reign of Richard II, and whose work remains readable, with effort, more than 6 centuries later. Chaucer was a courtier, a diplomat, a civil servant who moved in the highest circles of English society. He knew Italy and France, had read Boccaccio and Dante, understood the sophisticated literary culture of the continent. He chose to write not in French, the language of the English court, nor in Latin, the language of learning, but in English, the tongue of common people, the language that had been despised as crude and unfit for serious literature. The Canterbury Tales, his masterpiece, gathers a company of pilgrims journeying to the shrine of Thomas Becket and has them tell stories to pass the time. The pilgrims come from every rank of medieval society, knight and miller, prioress and pardoner, merchant and wife of Bath. Their tales range from courtly romance to bawdy farce, from moral allegory to animal fable. Together, they create a portrait of 14th century England, more vivid and immediate than any chronicle or document. Chaucer wrote other works as well, dream visions and philosophical poems, translations and adaptations. But the Canterbury Tales secured his legacy. Later generations would call him the father of English poetry. And while the title simplifies a complex history, it captures something true. Chaucer proved that English could be a vehicle for the highest literary art. He gave dignity to the vernacular and permission to those who came after to write in their native tongue. Other voices joined the chorus. William Langland's Piers Plowman offered a visionary critique of medieval society, its corruption and injustice, its failure to live up to Christian ideals. The anonymous poet of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight crafted an Arthurian romance of extraordinary beauty and psychological subtlety. The mystery plays, performed by craft guilds in towns like York and Chester, brought biblical stories to life for audiences who could not read. The language itself was transforming. The English of Chaucer's day was Middle English, significantly different from the Anglo-Saxon of before the conquest, significantly different too from the modern language that would emerge in the 16th century. But the trajectory was clear. English was becoming a national language, capable of expressing anything that could be expressed in French or Latin or any other tongue. The medieval centuries forged the instrument that Shakespeare would later play, the common law and common memory. The medieval inheritance was not only literary. The institutions that would govern England for centuries, that would spread around the world wherever English power reached, took their essential form during the long centuries between Hastings and Bosworth. The common law, that distinctive English approach to justice, grew from the practices of the royal courts as they expanded their jurisdiction under the Angevin kings. Unlike the Roman law that prevailed on the continent, common law developed case by case, precedent by precedent, the decisions of individual judges accumulating into a body of principle that subsequent judges were expected to follow. The flexibility of this approach, its capacity to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining continuity with the past, would prove remarkably durable. Parliament, that assembly of lords and commons that had evolved from the great councils of earlier kings, emerged from the medieval period as an essential part of English government. The king could not tax without parliamentary consent. Legislation required parliamentary approval. Grievances could be aired, petitions presented. The royal government held to some measure of accountability. The institution was far from democratic in any modern sense. The commons represented a narrow elite of landowners and urban oligarchs. But the principle of representation, of government through consultation with the realm, had been established. Local government too bore the medieval stamp. The sheriff, that royal officer, responsible for maintaining order and collecting revenues in each county, dated back before the conquest. The justice of the peace, the unpaid local magistrate who handled minor offences and kept the king's peace, emerged in the 14th century. The parish, the manor, the borough, each with its own customary arrangements for managing common affairs, formed the basic units of English local administration. These structures would persist, adapted, and reformed, but recognisably continuous, long after the medieval period had passed. Even the idea of England itself was a medieval creation. The kingdom that Alfred the Great had begun to forge from the chaos of the Viking invasions, that the Norman and Angevin kings had consolidated and administered, that had survived civil wars and plagues and foreign conflicts, had developed a sense of itself as a distinct nation with its own customs, its own institutions, its own identity. The English who fought at Agincourt knew themselves as English, different from the French they fought, proud of their difference. This national consciousness, which would deepen and intensify in the centuries to come, was among the most important legacies the medieval period bequeathed. Ghosts in the landscape. You are walking through the English countryside on an autumn afternoon, perhaps in the Cotswolds, perhaps in East Anglia, perhaps anywhere in this island that was already ancient when the Normans came. The light is golden and soft. The air smells of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. You are surrounded by ghosts. There, in the pattern of the hedgerows, you can trace the outlines of medieval fields, the long strips where villains once laboured in the summer heat. The hedges follow boundaries that were old when Henry VIII was young. The oaks that stand at their corners may be descendants of trees that shaded peasants, resting from their work 500 years ago. There, in the village you approach, the church tower rises above the rooftops, exactly as it rose when Richard III rode past on his way to Bosworth. The stones have weathered, the pointing has been renewed, but the essential structure remains what medieval masons built. Inside, if you enter, you will find a font that has held baptismal water for 30 generations, benches worn smooth by the weight of worshippers across the centuries, memorials to people whose descendants may still live in the houses you passed on your way. There, in the field beyond the village, a slight depression in the grass marks where houses once stood. This is a deserted medieval village, one of thousands that dot the English landscape, abandoned when plague or enclosure or simple economic change made the old settlement untenable. If you walked across that field with a metal detector, you might find buckles and coins, broken pottery and lost tools, the small debris of lives lived and ended centuries ago. The roads you drive remember medieval travellers. The market towns where you stop for tea were chartered by medieval kings. The universities where students still study were founded by medieval bishops. The very language in which you think, in which this story has been told, was shaped by medieval tongues, Norman, French and Anglo-Saxon, and the Latin of the Church blending into the English that feels so natural you forget it has a history. The medieval world is not gone. It is here, beneath the surface, visible to those who know how to look. It is in the place names that preserve Old English words, in the property boundaries that follow forgotten divisions, in the festivals that still mark the turning of the agricultural year. It is in the bones of London, in the street plan that remembers medieval lanes, in the churches that survived the Great Fire because they were too far from the conflagration's heart. It is in you, in the assumptions you hold about law and liberty and the proper relationship between ruler and ruled. You walk on through the autumn afternoon, and the ghosts walk with you. They always have, they always will, the dream of Camelot. Why do we still dream of the medieval world? Why do the knights and castles, the kings and quests, the tournaments and troubadours, still exercise such power over our imagination? Perhaps because the medieval period was itself a dreamer of dreams. The men and women of those centuries looked back to an imagined past and forward to a promised heaven. They lived suspended between memory and hope, between the lost glories of Rome and the eternal glories of the New Jerusalem. This habit of longing, of living in stories, of finding meaning in myth and legend, shaped everything they built. The Arthurian legends that we still tell today took their classic form in the medieval centuries. The Round Table, the quest for the Grail, the sword in the stone, the love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the last battle where Arthur fell, all of this was elaborated and embroidered by medieval writers working centuries after any historical Arthur could have lived. Thomas Malory wrote his great compilation of Arthurian romance while imprisoned during the Wars of the Roses, dreaming of a better age, while the nobility butchered one another in the name of succession. We have inherited that dream. When we imagine castles, we imagine them not as they were, cold and brutal and often squalid, but as they appear in fairy tales, all towers and pennants and beautiful princesses. When we imagine knights, we imagine them not as the armoured killers they often were, but as the chivalric ideals they sometimes aspired to be. We dream the dream that the medieval period dreamed about itself, and in dreaming it, we keep something alive that might otherwise be lost. Perhaps this is what every age does, with its past, transforms it into usable mythology, into stories that serve present needs. The medieval world we imagine is not the medieval world that was, but it is real nonetheless, real as any story is real in its power to move and inspire and console. The dream of Camelot endures. Across the centuries, we began in the autumn of 1066, with exhausted warriors stumbling south to face an invasion that would change everything. We have travelled through 4 centuries of English history, through conquest and cathedral building, through plague and peasant revolt, through wars abroad and wars at home. Now we stand at the threshold of a new age, looking back at the long medieval twilight. The world that the Tudors inherited was not the world that William the Conqueror had made. The confident hierarchies of the feudal order had crumbled. The monasteries that had preserved learning and offered prayer would soon be swept away entirely. The great noble families that had contested the throne for generations had largely destroyed one another. Something was ending, and something new was beginning, though those who lived through the transition could not have known what the future would hold. Yet so much remained. The cathedrals still stood and stand still. The common law still governed and governed still. Parliament still met and meets still. The English language that Chaucer had wielded with such skill continued to evolve, continued to absorb new words and new possibilities, continued its long journey toward Shakespeare and Milton, toward Dickens and Austen, toward the global tongue it has become. The medieval world passed away, but it did not vanish. It became the foundation on which all that followed was built. When you look at England today, you are looking at a palimpsest, a manuscript written over many times but never entirely erased. Beneath the modern surface lie the Tudor editions, and beneath those the medieval structures, and beneath those the Anglo-Saxon and Roman and even older layers still. History does not disappear, it accumulates. It becomes the ground we stand on, the air we breathe, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Medieval England was a world of faith and violence, of beauty and cruelty, of soaring aspiration and grinding poverty. It was a world where peasants laboured their whole lives in the same fields their ancestors had worked, where kings rose and fell with bewildering frequency, where plague could empty half a kingdom in a single terrible year. It was a world nothing like our own, and yet a world that made our own possible. We are its heirs, whether we know it or not. May these historical reflections have brought you comfort and calm. The candles gutter in the cathedral now. The last monks file out of the choir. The fields lie quiet under the autumn stars. Somewhere, a bell rings for Compline, the final prayer of the day, and the medieval world settles into the sleep from which it will not quite awaken, and from which it will never entirely depart. Rest gently in the embrace of time's endless stories.